as we're going through these things, as you're looking at these kind of pieces of feedback that you're getting, no matter what it is, getting somebody to change a habit that is very ingrained in them for years is going to be challenging.
Your job is to get them to continue to do the things they inherently need to do and keep them interested in it for that long. At this point, it seems that we're just going to go ahead and jump into this biofeedback. It's clearly indicating that we need to talk about what's normal versus what's common, i.e. the art of bracketing when we're doing coaching, and how do we know if we're on the right track? So in today's coaching confessions, Steven is going to go down. He's already gone down a rabbit hole here a little bit of admitting something that I had no idea he was doing as a client early on in our coaching relationship. Steve, would you like to share with the audience the devious method that you had to help you feel fuller while we were cutting?
You know, I wouldn't really call it devious though. Like there was never any clear guidelines. I'd like to state that to start. And it felt convenient at the time because, you know, when you weigh specifically things like pastas and rice before you cook them and make them weigh a little more with some water, if you weigh them pre-cooking dry, you might get a little more to eat. And there's no clear indication on the internet that 1 cup of dry versus 1 cup of wet thing has any different, like that's the appropriate measure. Like on the back of the box, it doesn't say this is cooked or this is uncooked. It doesn't say that. When you're looking at your volume or your weight and you're consuming, it just says 3 grams of this, 3 ounces of this. Is it? Was it 3 grams cooked or is it 3 grams not cooked? You don't know. You have no idea. So, internet couldn't tell me, Andrew didn't tell me, and the back of the box didn't tell me. So I decided to deploy unique mechanisms and be like, if I'm really hungry, I'm going to weigh it dry. And if I'm supposed to not eat as much, I'm going to weigh it wet. And that's just a way we went, you know, just a way we went.
So I had no idea this was going on, by the way. You can tell what kind of coach I am. And by the way, there are different biases that coaches will have for those of you that have never had nutrition coaching, or maybe you are one and you've never had. Again, so for me as a coach, I don't fuck around with nutrition labels. I won't like take some complex recipe, try to break it down and put it in there. I just avoid that food, frankly. I would rather just be like, all right, listen, I need to know what I'm eating. So I'm just going to eat a sweet potato. I'm going to eat some rice. I'm going to eat something that's a single ingredient food that I don't have to think about as much because it's already a challenge for me. And granted, I have a disordered eating history, so getting me to track in general is going to be weird. But I think that what you're highlighting right now, Steve, is very important for people to clarify as they're having these coaching conversations. And by the way, guys, this was over 2 years ago by this point. He just gets on the call today. He's like laughing about it. I'm like, are you good? Like, and he's like, oh, did you ever know? And I'm like, no, clearly I didn't. What? I would have rectified this quickly because 5 ounces is comprised of also water and the pasta, which thus means that you would probably have less. And there are, in these days, I've seen pasta boxes that have it wet versus dry. Because that is something that you want to consider. Same thing when you're cooking rice. I think the general rule of thumb is like 3/4 of dry rice equals 1 cup of 3/4 of a cup equals 1 cup cooked. So you kind of go through that method because obviously the water is going to expand it and the water is going to add weight to it. And thus, if you're doing the same weight, you're going to have a little bit less in terms of whatever the caloric density or macronutrient split would be. But I think it is really important for us to understand, let's say that, and this is the funny part because I slap a whoop on all the clients that I work with because I want to see objectively, what do we see is changing? We use that, we use the weight, and those are the things that we know we can't really argue, right? They are just the number. And if it's consistent, it's reliable. It doesn't necessarily, it doesn't work really well one day and then terribly the next day and then it works great one day. Like we know it's going to be pretty consistent. We can measure change, which is the most important thing, right? And so because Steve's biofeedback was doing so well, I mean, I didn't ask questions. I was like, okay, it's working, whatever it is. And so that's where having that coach client relationship of like, all right, even if he was doing something completely weird, we wouldn't even have that conversation unless something was going wrong
I
and we needed to
just
course
to throw it out
correct.
there, I think that I might have weighed things dry 3 times maybe. And I'll never forget the
Okay.
third time where it was like, healthy protein pasta, which is a little bit denser and stuff like that.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I
Yep.
want to say I was like, oh, I weighed out like 6 ounces, 5, 6 ounces for
Hmm.
whatever reason. On the other side of that, cooked in my bowl, I got halfway through and I'm like,
Yeah.
man, I can't eat. Like I am stuffed. Like it was one of those like I felt like a commercial of in that moment he knew he fucked up. Like type things should have been going on
A
or
lot of
playing.
that.
But I
A lot of
for
that.
me, what I knew is I needed to be consistent in the way that I do it. And I knew doing it dry intentionally so I could eat more was clearly not being consistent, right? So, but that was my biggest thing. I was like, all right, you know what? Ha ha, it's funny. Man, I can't eat this much. All right, no matter what, you should just be consistent because that's the important thing. So, anyways, I don't want people to think
Yeah.
like for an entire year I pick and chose weighing it
No.
dry or cooked.
And it's funny though, because when we think about the nature of our desires and the cravings we have, they can be indications of what your body might need. So maybe if you did want to eat some more that day, maybe your body, inherently might have kind of gravitated and helped you narrow your decision making to support that subconsciously, which is a fascinating topic of, we'll kind of recreate the situation's parameters for execution to fit the narrative and to fit what we're looking for inside of that. And what ultimately we're talking about today is obviously um, the concept of how do you know is your plan, how's your plan working? Is it working? Is it not working? Are you getting closer to target? Or are you getting further to target? And if you're a coach and you've been a coach for any amount of time, you know that one of the most dangerous things to do is to track progress as soon as your client steps on the scale. And that's the only progress point you have. There's nothing to say the 168 hours, if you do it once a week leading up to that, 168 hours is how many hours are in a week, between weigh-ins, we have no idea what behaviors are happening, what things are not working, right? We don't know how the body's responding to changes unless we're asking very specific questions. And that's how we can then start to give ourselves immediate feedback, or at least more frequent feedback, the same way that if your dog is, let's say you get a new puppy
Don't get
comes
a
in,
new puppy.
pees on the
Don't get
floor,
a new puppy.
like Cooper, pees on the floor, right? And you don't, or whatever, however you correct the dog, right? You don't correct the dog for like 36 hours. And then out of nowhere, you correct the animal. It wouldn't make sense. And so we're borrowing principles from the behavioral psychology of there's a stimulus, there's a response. The more quickly we can create those associations where if we now maybe positively reinforce a behavior, we say, hey, dog, don't eat or, don't pee inside. We take the dog outside, dog pees outside, we give it a treat. If it pees inside, we don't give it a treat. It starts to associate peeing outside with a treat. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to correlate behaviors with something that's kind of a reward or a negative. And that's what we call contrast coaching. And that's one of the reasons why directive based coaches of people that say, you have to do this, you have to do this at this time in this order. It's not really reinforcing autonomy. It's not helping that person create buy in a lot of times. And we find that it's very transactional and that person doesn't learn how to think for themselves. So equipping people with something called biofeedback, which is someone's body or their biology giving them feedback of this works for me, this doesn't work for me. Because I'm sure we would all agree the same plan doesn't work the same way for everybody because there's a lot of unique environmental constraints. So Steve, I mean, I'd be very curious, from a consumer end of things, what are the things that you noticed in terms of biofeedback during your coaching process?
I think, each day I'll go through, so to speak, the day that I felt. It was always waking up and like, do I feel good, energetic, or the opposite today? And what does that look like? And correlating that to
Mm-hmm.
the actions I took day before. So for me, it was always going down that road of waking up that morning and like, do I feel good? Do I not feel good? Right? Like what yesterday's
Mm-hmm.
actions, my eating, my hydration, my workouts, what did that do to me waking up today? Do I feel good? Do I not
Yeah.
feel good? And how am I going to tackle this day type mentality? I always had Whoop, and I'm one of those people where Whoop would say like, "Oh, you're 7% recovered." I'm like, "Cool. I'm going to push through it. Like the Whoop never made me slow down or go harder in my workout. It wasn't, oh, you're 97% recovered. I'm like, all right, let me push harder. Like, no, I'm going to show up and give my workout whatever my 100% is today. But I could definitely feel you go and you crush yourself 5, 6 days in a row, whatever it might be. Workouts just work the day included. And you're like, you wake up and I'm like, man, I'm tired today, feeling that. So that was always the big
Yeah.
piece of my day I would start with. The next pieces of biofeedback really came down to me and like my level of fullness, I would say, right? How full was I always? We've talked about it before where like going to bed, I don't like to be full when I'm going to sleep. I like to be not necessarily
Mhm.
hungry, but I don't want to be full, but I also don't enjoy feeling full all day long. I remember when we were going through our first
Mhm.
real bulk together and I was just like, dude, I am full all day. Like just all day and like all right cool I did it for a good 6, 7, 8 weeks and the results were there,
Mhm.
but I remember finally on one of our calls and being like, dude, I'm done. Like I can't push this anymore to increase and to gain like all those things. So that feeling of full, like that's one thing that I don't love. I just feel lethargic and slowed down.
Mhm.
um Sleep is always something that I'm pretty good at. That's not a challenge for me, so I don't think about that. But that would be a next one that usually comes up for me. Where if I was going to be coaching somebody at this stage of the game, like what does sleep look like if you have a Whoop on or something like that, we're going to get some of that data. And ultimately, like
Mhm.
hydration. Hey, how many times do you go into the bathroom? How many times do you have to go urinate throughout the day? What does that look like? Because I think most people under consume water. I, on the other hand, probably over consume water. Um, so it's one of those components where like, all right, are we drinking too much? Are we drinking too little? And what does that potentially do to the body? But those were the always my highlights. I mean, there's certain instances and like, oh, we're going through this progressive overload stage, and I'm like, dude, you're driving me to the ground. I love it, but I'm tired. Like, but that's not an all the time thing. So those would be the things that immediately pop up for me.
Yeah, and that's, most people will agree with that. In my experience, people say like, "All right, I don't feel good." Now, that's an outcome though of a lot of different things that lead up to that. The sleep thing, the fullness thing, right? The energy, those are all correlates that help us understand a bigger picture. And if generally speaking, you feel good, you'll work out harder. If you work out harder, your body is likely to change more substantively. Right now, the more hard days you can stack because you take great care of yourself, because you're recovering well, because you're sleeping 7 to 9 hours, you're consuming roughly half your body weight in ounces plus 22 to 24 ounces of water after exercise within 2 hours. If you're consuming, your maintenance calories, like all those things are prerequisites for most people, generally speaking, thriving and making that meaningful progress as it relates to putting on, adding some muscle tissue, reducing some body fat for the most part. And that's kind of what a recomp protocol looks like, or gaintaining, if you want to call it that. There's a lot of different ways that we can measure that. But the last thing, again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to drive home here is that you have things that are called lagging indicators, things that by the time they roll around, it's already too late. Think about driving past a speed limit sign. You don't see it, right? And then you get pulled over by a cop and they're like, hey, you were speeding. You're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. That would be a lagging indicator where now something bad has happened that you have to readjust, and it drastically changes the process. So one of the things, another example as it relates to fitness, would be if you're under eating, but you're still trying to strength train heavy. And I mean strength training, meaning like you're 85% above your 1RM. If you're underfed and you're doing that to your body, you're going to run your nervous system in the ground. And traditionally, when we think about overtraining syndrome, or basically what happens before you get to injury, most people, when they start lifting, they're excited, right? After a while, if you start working out too hard, you start to get a little bit tired and you're not as enthusiastic about it. That's kind of one step closer to burnout, right? And then when we look at, if you're not enthused about it and you keep working out at that intensity and you're not taking great care of yourself, then what you'll find is that you'll probably start to really dread training a little bit, and you'll really not look forward to it. Like you just don't want to be there anymore. And that's usually where most people will stop. That's why people fall off bandwagon. But for the people that do persist beyond that because they have some strong internal motivation, now what'll happen is that they'll continue to grind themselves into the dirt. And this is where they'll start developing nagging injuries. Things that aren't really like gonna take you out that long, but maybe like they tweak a hip, maybe the knee feels funky, maybe the shoulder just kind of takes a little bit longer to warm up, right? We know that tissue stiffness is a precursor and also an indication of muscle damage the same way that soreness is. And so when people wake up stiff, that could be an indication that you might be overtraining a little bit day after, right? Or even 48 hours. But long story short, excited, not looking forward to it, dreading it, nagging injuries. And then eventually, if you continue push past those nagging injuries, that's where you start to run into actual injury, right? So before we metaphorically run into that police officer that pulls us over because we're speeding, there are all these other stop signs, there are all these traffic signs, there are all these speed limit signs that are posted that we just didn't pay attention to. And that's what it takes to be a good coach, is that the work is the work. If you want to get a heavier bench press, you have to bench press. If you want to get faster at sprinting, you have to sprint. But there's the things between the sprinting and the benching that make the biggest difference. So you want to figure out, well, what are the leading indicators? What are the speed limit posting signs that we can pay attention to that'll let us know, hey, even if there is a cop up there, no problem, we're going to just keep driving. And that's where we look at a shreds model to get this into the practical tactical as we start to wrap up here a little bit. But most people will benefit. And there are so many different things your body can tell you. Some people look at hormones, which is a form of biofeedback. You can do that with labs, blood testing. Some people look at stool test, also another piece of biofeedback. Some people look at neuroimaging, right? There's a lot of really in-depth stuff. Most coaches won't really mess with that. But what most coaches probably should understand, sleep quality, sleep quantity, right? We kind of use the shreds model. And forgive me, I don't know where this came from. I just used it so long, but someone did credit and kind of create this model. But sleep, hydration, hunger, right? Where we're looking at, are you hungrier? Are you not hungry at all? Probably an indication. If you're stressed, you're probably going to have that go up or down. That means that you might be maladaptive, right? When we look at R, we're looking at recovery. Are you feeling beat up between workouts? Or are you feeling like you're mostly recovered, which is kind of where we want to be? You don't want to really be fully recovered between workouts, right? You should have some fatigue that carries over. That's normal. If you're not fatigued at all, chances are your training program is either not pushing you hard enough or you're not executing it at a high enough intensity to see meaningful adaptation. And you might as well just not probably do that workout if you're trying to get the strength training benefit from it. If you want to use it for active recovery, it makes a lot of sense, right? But are you recovered or are you not recovered? Then we look at E, which is energy, SHR, and then we're in the E for shreds, right, is the acronym that it makes. But E is basically, do you have more energy? Do you have less energy? Or are you about the same? And this is where, and this is a hot take here, but most people think that you shouldn't have an energy crash in the middle of your day. And there's nothing that could be further from the truth. It is very normal to have lower energy at that 2 to 3 p.m. mark. Now, you shouldn't completely crash and not be able to function, right? But you should have a lull in there because your cortisol peak, which your cortisol, you have this thing, cortisol, by the way, for I assume stress hormone, should be the highest about 30 minutes after waking and kind of in that first part of your morning. But then it should go down for the rest of your day. It's the reason why you get out of bed for the most part. If you weren't stressed and there was no reason to get out of bed, you probably have a loungy morning, right? Now, you don't want to be stressed at night, so you want to see that go lower as the day goes on. The problem with this is that most people will get in there and they'll feel tired, and people think that being tired is not normal. They think, oh my gosh, I can't do this right now, and they'll reach for more caffeine. And that'll then bump their stress hormone back up, and they'll start to get poorer sleep because you kind of want to consume that caffeine. People will digest and break it down at different speeds, but most people, within 4 to 12 hours, that caffeine dosage will get cut in half. It's called the half-life. So if you consume 1 cup of coffee, and let's just say it's 100 milligrams, then let's just say 12 hours later, it's going to be at 50 milligrams and it's still circulating, right? And then another 12 hours later, it'll be at 25 milligrams, right? And so these things start to stack over time, which is why when you're tired in the afternoon, you caffeinate, you'll sleep kind of poorly that day, which will make you tired the next day, which will then cause you to grab more caffeine. And it really becomes this vicious cycle of poor energy, poor sleep, and then having to caffeinate. And then eventually you need more caffeine. So that's why as a coach, it's really important for you to be able to catch those cycles of behavior and be able to understand what that might be telling people and how they're coping with it, right? But that's E, energy. So are you having more energy? Is it from food? Is it from a lack of food? So on and so forth, right? We know that if you're not fed, you're probably gonna be tired. Makes sense. But then D, digestion. So some people that are really stressed, they travel a lot, generally speaking, will have poor digestion. We can use the Bristol stool chart, but for those of you that don't know, the average bowel movement frequency per week is about 3, right? And when I say average, I mean in the literature, that's considered normal. Some people, and in fact, I actually had one person I was doing a consultation with. She was a software engineer. She had 7 children. She worked 3 jobs. And she said that she had 1 bowel movement a month because she wouldn't basically eat all day. She would literally have a thing of candies right there next to her desk. Whenever she'd start getting tired, she would eat a candy. And she would have these bowel movements the week of her period. That's how she knew her period would be coming. So there are a lot of people that have a lot of different things. And when we look at what's healthy and stuff like that, I mean, you probably want to move waste out of your system, right? And the 4 ways you do that: sweating, breathing, pooping, and peeing. So if you're not doing one
12
of those
times a
3
year,
things,
you
you're just going
realize
to.
that, right?
I
Like
know.
that's
I was shot 13.
like
13.
that's 13. That's my week.
That's wild.
I would die.
That's
I'd
wild.
go to
But
the
I mean, like,
hospital
hey,
because I think there's something wrong.
100%. And here's the thing, though. People genetically inclined different lifestyles. I mean, and that's definitely a symptom of poor gut motility for sure, right? And there's also things like when we look at bloating, for people that are bloating, sometimes that is a good indication depending upon where you feel that. It could be something that is more aligned with, like, if it's a higher GI thing, you might not be moving stuff through your digestive tract as much, right? And that could then cause something called putrefaction. There's a lot of different things that happen inside of that. But the thing we're looking at in the biofeedback is, do you have this, yes or no? If you do have it, what can we further drill down? What do we need to know? What do we need to further have a conversation around? Right. So that's kind of D, SHRED. I have to count on my fingers, so forgive me. But the last S is usually stress, right? And what we're looking at is, do you feel very overwhelmed? In which case, if you're very overwhelmed and we give you a crazy training program, you're either not going to execute it, you're going to skip it, and or you're going to do it and you're going to get hurt because you're going to try to caffeinate through it. And that's where you have to, as a coach, be able to refine and give people the minimum effective dose that they can tolerate and potentially see those positive benefits from. If you drive them on the ground all the time because your program design isn't happening, or let's God forbid, you're not doing these assessments, you don't catch it. That's how your clients who know themselves very well will leave you as a coach because they feel like they're not safe, whether it's actually not safe because the training program's crazy and or they're not getting the results. And so their time isn't safe. And that's a different element that we want to consider as we're going through this. But 2 more that I'd like to propose is libido and mood. If you don't want to have sex, chances are it's a problem, unless you're just not attracted to your partner, and that's a different conversation. And mood, if you feel like you're in a shitty mood all the time, chances are your self-care is usually pretty poor. And you're doing a poor job of setting boundaries, which is an environmental thing, right? And you probably don't feel supported or fulfilled. And so those are deeper conversations that go beyond just the program design, just beyond the exercise, the fitness, the nutrition. And that's where the coaching element comes in, of actually building a meaningful relationship and being able to sit down with people and just either hold space for them or help them navigate something. But we find that people in the coaching industry tend to often adopt that role of mental health quasi, armchair psychologist. And it's really important that you just take the time to understand what's going on biologically, so that way you can support them psychologically, and ultimately you'll have really that entire plan come together. So as it relates to biofeedback, the Shreds model, libido, mood, and when I say libido, just so we're all clear, I'm referring to sex drive, right? And then, whatever else you want to add in there. Some people will use weight as a biofeedback because that's biological. It's feedback. It's going up or it's going down, right? Some people use an in-body. Some people will use labs. So you have to find, and I would say probably pick no more than 7 things to measure. And that's even a lot for most people, right? I would say probably have your clients focus on 2 to 3 things that are most meaningful. Otherwise, you'll get drowned out in the noise, and it'll be really hard to get them to focus on the right thing. So all that to say, Steve, what would you suggest for people as we wrap up this episode here as they relates to lagging and leading indicators, maybe, a business paradigm or perspective or client?
If you can't consume a gram of caffeine a day and still go to sleep, then you're just being a whatever word you want to
Have you ever had
whatever word
trauma?
you want to
Have you
insert
ever
in
had
there.
trauma?
No, it's you bring up the energy crash, you bring up the caffeine example and everything, and obviously there was a time where when you were coaching me, I was consuming over a gram of caffeine a day, and if your typical cup
Yeah,
of
that's
coffee is like
wild.
85
Like
to
2
90
pops, right?
milligrams. So, when you look at that, it's like, oh, 13 plus cups of coffee. Now, I wasn't literally drinking that much in coffee. I was getting it in various forms. but you don't know how much that is actually impacting you or affecting you until like you give it a try.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when you say to somebody, "Hey, you got to give up caffeine," like 99.9% of people are like, "Yeah, no, I don't. I'm fine. It doesn't affect me." So
Hmm.
the thing that I found, or at least
Yeah.
for me, when it really comes to change, is all right. What does Steve really want? What did I want in those conversations? What was the outcome that I was desiring? Now, the caffeine, sure, there's a lot of negatives to it, but I wanted to go in bulk. I wanted to gain more weight. Well, we know caffeine is actually an appetite
Yeah.
suppressant. Well, hey, Steve, we
Yeah.
know you eating this much food is not going to be easy on you. If we consume less or no caffeine, it'll probably be easier to go and gain more muscle. And I'm like, man, I really want to gain muscle. I want to gain more muscle more than I want to consume all the caffeine. And for me, it was an easy,
Hmm.
all right, cool, no more caffeine. So much so that the next time we
Yeah.
got on a call, you were very surprised that I was just like, all right, I'm done. Kind of a dull headache and I'm tired. But then, like, the week later, I'm like, cool. That's not
Yeah.
normal for people, like the caffeine transition, all those components. But as we're going through these things, as you're looking at these kind of pieces of feedback that you're getting, no matter what it is,
Hmm.
getting somebody to change a habit that is very ingrained in them for years, is
Yeah.
going to be challenging unless they are intrinsically motivated enough to make that change. And that intrinsic motivation
Yeah.
needs to really be tied down to whatever it is that they want. So for me, drink less caffeine, go gain muscle. Super logical, made a lot of sense. There's a lot of jumps in there, and I didn't need
Hmm.
to understand all the science.
Yeah.
But when you're looking to help somebody make a change that you know is good for them, understanding their biggest motivation is going to be key. And there's probably also a reason like, hey, we could do one of three things. Okay. Here's option A,
Hmm.
here's option B, here's option C. My scenario, and I
Yeah.
don't know if this is good or not, but Steve, we can cut down caffeine by 25%, by 50%, or 100%. 25% means you'll eat a little bit more. It's going to take you longer to gain muscle. 50%, slight increases. 100%, you'll gain muscle the fastest. Which road would you rather take based upon your goals and have them again continue to build buy in around creating that plan with them? You're guiding them, you're giving them the advice, but you're helping them self select the item that they're likely to go execute at a higher level because they got to choose and it achieves their outcome. Forcing people, just telling them do this. Like I had a coach once and it was like, go eat bagels and eggs every morning for breakfast. And I'm like, but bagels aren't healthy. I don't understand why I would want to eat a bagel. Like that makes no sense to me. And, hey, can you explain it? Just go eat bagels and eggs. Do you want to know what I never did? I never ate bagels. Now, on the other side of a coach who was willing to give, like, well, here's the way we look at healthy and unhealthy, and here's the parameters and all those things. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
one bagel's not that bad,
Yeah.
actually. Like, five bagels are bad, or in a bagel every day is bad,
Yeah.
especially when you're eating a shit ton of carbs throughout the day is bad. But if I have a bagel, it's actually pretty good. And now, like, I have these bagels that have, I don't know, 25 grams of protein and like 30 grams of fiber and it actually tastes pretty good. And it's an everything bagel. I'm like, this is a really good in between of getting something that's super healthy, but I still have a bagel. And then I can put eggs on it, and now I'm good and I'm in control, but I don't need to have one every day.
Hmm.
So creating that buy in
Yeah.
matters. The biofeedback matters if they're willing to make the change to help solve the thing ultimately that matters to them. So at a certain point, I would also say don't collect feedback on something that people are likely or highly unlikely not going to change or to change. Collect feedback on things that people are probably going to be more willing to go ahead and make a change. Because if 7 is your maximum and that's a high end, do you want to waste that collection process on things that people are like, no, fuck you, I'm not doing it no matter what? In my mind, I would say no. I'm not the coach here, but we're going to focus on things I know you're willing to change and we'll add more things in as our relationship grows. So that's my soapbox
Hmm.
dissertation to wrap this up on biofeedback and consuming caffeine. I didn't have any caffeine today, though. I feel like I need a little bit now that I've talked about it so much.
Yeah, I'm about 300 megs deep. So, by the way, I'm used to like 1,500 to 2 grams. So everybody chill. But no, it's funny. Like as you're saying that, I think it's really really important to people to note that there's something called majoring in the minors, and that's where you hyperfixate on little granular details that aren't relevant whatsoever. And there was a point in time when we first started, you cared a lot more about little things, and one of which was the rice versus sweet potatoes. You remember
Oh,
that
yeah.
conversation? You're like, which one's better, rice or sweet potatoes? And I'm like, it doesn't fucking matter. I mean, sure, the vitamin and minerals, like you get a little more vitamin A with sweet potatoes, but that was a really big concern for you at the beginning. And I was like, yeah, trying to get you to care less over time has really been the nature of the game of like care about the things that are most meaningful. How do we know what's most meaningful? That's the problem with coaching, is that everyone thinks that you have a specific North Star of like these things matter. Like, I'll tell you, when I create client dashboards, every client has a different dashboard which compares an outcome versus a leading behavior. For instance, I have one dashboard that has a protein marker and a skeletal muscle mass marker. And I put those two things on a plot, and people can see when I eat more protein, my muscle goes up. When I lift more weights, my muscle goes up. And so that's kind of one of the ways that we can start to visualize that information. But to the point being is that, it seems like in my experience, and I'd love for you to weigh in on this, you've cared less about little minutia as we've gone along, and your testosterone is effectively like 5x, 4x, I think. Right. So there's something to be said about like stressing out about the little things, because when we think about caffeine, and I never thought about this while we were like kind of working through that process, it took about 18 months for your testosterone to kind of recover from probably years of that much caffeine consumption, because that's a stressful response, even if you were able to sleep, and like there were never any testosterone deficiency symptoms, but that is a pretty significant dose when we look at testosterone to caffeine ratios. And so decreasing that, now it's funny because last time you gave the labs up, you were like, yeah, they're, in the whatever they were, I think it was like the mid sevens. Um, and so when we think about like the nature of everything that we do is going to stress us out or not stress us out, like it takes time to have people recover from the things that they've been doing for years. And that's why you have to be meticulous and set whatever data collection process you have to capture those lagging indicators. You have to just be diligent, because it might not yield you anything up front or anything immediately. You might be like, well, why the fuck am I collecting this? Nothing's changing. It just might take that person's biology 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years to catch up to the things that you're doing. And that's the mastery of coaching, in that your job is to get them to continue to do the things they inherently need to do and keep them interested in it for that long. But the work is still the work. So all that to say, if you have anything that you think would be valuable for the audience or other listeners from a biofeedback, we'd love to know what you actually capture and what you use with your clients. If you could just comment that below, we would love to hear from you. In the meantime, if there's anything that you guys also would love to hear from us as we're going through, this is a highly requested topic for us of like, how do I know my coaching's effective? We use biofeedback to preempt the results. So if you want your voice heard, if you have any suggestions, there's a suggestion box. There's also the comment section. So please smash that subscribe button so you can stay updated. Turn on the alerts in that top corner in your settings. So that way, as these new episodes are coming out, trust me, you're not going to want to get left behind, especially when we start talking about how to integrate AI into your actual coaching practices in the next, I think it's like about 3 or 4 episodes down the road. So definitely smash that subscribe. And we appreciate you guys supporting us. We look forward to seeing you next time.